Welcome to John Carroll University and to the annual Catholic Studies lecture series. My name is Paul Murphy. I'm a professor of history here and the director of the Institute of Catholic Studies. This is an annual event, as many of you know, where we have distinguished speakers presenting to the broader community on issues of great significance to Catholics and the broader community and issues that touch on Catholic intellectual life. I would like to let you know that as we proceed, we will be taking questions from all of you, and we suggest you do this through the chat function, and we ask you to direct the question directly to Professor Hahnenberg tonight. It would be so much nicer if we could meet in one room on a milder evening than today with all our snow. We're into December. In fact, I was noting today it is the feast of St. Francis Xavier, one of the two most famous Jesuit saints. And so we continue to do our work here at the Institute of Catholic Studies and at John Carroll in that spirit of outgoing investigation of the world around us. And today we're going to do it with one of my favorite colleagues here on campus, a man who actually knows or knew the topic of his speech. I give talks about a guy who died 500 years ago. Ed Hahnenberg can talk about somebody that he rode in an elevator with. I would like to say that I'm sure most of you know this, but Father Ted Hesburgh was probably the most significant Catholic priest in the United States in the 20th century. That is, say, priests as opposed to hierarchical figures. His footprint in American Catholic higher education was enormous. And he obviously worked in a lot of areas outside of academic life. And we're very fortunate that our own Ed Hahnenberg is here to share his insights. Ed was appointed to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies in 2011. He is the inaugural holder of the Breen Chair in Catholic Systematic Theology. And in fact, he holds degrees, 3 degrees from the University of Notre Dame. So he's actually what you call a triple domer, a rare bird, actually. This includes, of course, his Ph.D. in theology. He has written extensively in the areas of ecclesiology and the theology and ministry of the laity. Most recently, Ed has published a biography of Father Hesburgh, the longtime president of Notre Dame. The title of the book is Theodore Hesburgh, CSC, Bridge Builder. Father Ted led Notre Dame through a period of great change that was social, religious, and political, as well as all of the ferment academically of the modern Catholic university in the United States. So this is an issue actually that's quite timely for us as we live at a time of great social, political, and religious change as well. So I'm very grateful for Ed's willingness, his freedom to share with us this evening. So please welcome my esteemed colleague, Ed Hahnenberg.
Great. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to just take a minute here to share my screen. Make sure you all can see it. Okay. Paul, could you give me a thumbs up if you can see the slide? Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for that invitation, that introduction, and for the invitation into the Institute of Catholic Studies for giving me this opportunity. I also want to say a special thank you to the John Carroll Alumni Association and to the Notre Dame Club of Cleveland for helping to publicize this talk. It's great to have the chance, the invitation, the opportunity to share some thoughts on a really remarkable person, Father Theodore M. Hesburgh, CSC, and to explore a little of what his life and vision might have to say about the promise and the challenge of the Catholic University today. As Paul mentioned, a lot of what I have to share comes out of research I did for a recently published book, which was just one of the funnest books I've written, getting to know this incredible character. However, in preparing for this, this talk, it occurred to me that the audience tonight could probably be divided neatly into two groups: those who have heard of Father Ted Hesburgh and those who have not. So the first group would include everybody with a degree or 3 from Notre Dame, maybe those who've been to campus, the campus of Notre Dame, for a football game, or maybe older Catholics who generally know Catholic-y kinds of things. The second group, those who don't know or haven't heard of Father Ted, is everybody else, and most people really, which is too bad, because at one point in time, I think Paul is right, Father Hesburgh was arguably the most well-known priest in America. He was certainly the most well-known university president, and for good reason. In 1952, Hesburgh became the 15th president of the University of Notre Dame at the ripe old age of 35, with a total of 4 years of administrative experience under his belt. And he served as president for the next 35 years, so from 1952 to 1987. And his tenure was truly transformational. During his time as president, enrollment at the university grew from just under 5,000 to almost 10,000. The number of dollars dedicated to research rose from under 1 million to 15 million. The number of faculty rose from 389 to 950 full-time faculty members. And the endowment grew from $9 million to $350 million. So this guy could raise money, which is kind of ironic because Hesburgh grew up in Syracuse, New York, in Most Holy Rosary Parish. And he remembers those days growing up in between the wars when the pastor was trying to finish these building projects, right? He grew up going to church in the school auditorium because they hadn't finished building the church yet. The Depression got in the way. And he just got so tired of hearing the priest, his pastor, ask for money. It was one of the reasons that he was drawn to life in a religious community rather than the diocesan priesthood, because he thought he'd never have to raise money as a religious priest. But he raised money and he did it quite well. In the midst of all of this growth, Hesburgh guided Notre Dame through 2 historic transitions. The first was to transfer university governance from the Congregation of the Holy Cross, his own religious community, to a predominantly lay board of trustees in 1967. It was a bold move that was soon followed by virtually every Catholic college and university in the country. The second transition was the admission of women to the undergraduate program in 1972. And he accomplished all of this while maintaining a crushing schedule of off-campus commitments. And it really was this life of public service that made Hesburgh more than just a wildly successful college president, but one of the leading public figures of 20th century America. He served on the National Science Board at the height of the Cold War and in the midst of the space race. He was a charter member and later chair of the US Civil Rights Commission, working on racial justice through the turmoil of the 60s. He served on the Presidential Clemency Board in the aftermath of Vietnam. Over the course of his career, Hesburgh accepted a total of 16 presidential appointments and dozens of other assignments. He helped launch the Peace Corps under Kennedy. He worked on immigration reform long before Reagan. I was looking for this quote. In November of 1979, columnist Coleman McCarthy observed, with tongue firmly in cheek, "For a few perilous moments last month, the federal government was left dangling without the services of the Reverend Theodore Hesburgh. When his work on the President's Commission on the Holocaust ended, a full 48 hours passed before he was appointed to head the Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy." I mean, look at this guy. He's like Forrest Gump in a Roman collar. He was just everywhere. His extracurricular activities involved membership on the boards of hundreds of organizations. Some were right up his alley, like a stint on the Harvard University Board of Overseers, the first priest ever to join this elite group, a group that chose him twice to serve as board chair. Some were more of a stretch. So when David Rockefeller asked Hesburgh to join the board of Chase Manhattan Bank, Hesburgh laughed. He said, "I've never even had a checking account. Right? You know, I've taken a vow of poverty, right?" And in early when in early 1968, the administrator of NASA, Jim Webb, offered Hesburgh the #2 slot at the space agency with the clear implication that he wanted Hesburgh to succeed him as head of NASA. Hesburgh demurred. Right? "My degrees are in philosophy and theology," he said, "not astrophysics." Hesburgh went on, he did serve for 9 years on the Chase Manhattan board, but he decided not to run NASA. Alongside his service to country, Hesburgh took on an exhausting array of other commitments around the world. As president of the International Federation of Catholic Universities from 1963 to 1970, he led that organization through historic change. As Vatican representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency, he facilitated dialogue between American and Soviet scientists. He served 11 years as chair of the Overseas Development Council, 21 years on the board of the Rockefeller Foundation. He literally oversaw millions of dollars in aid to developing nations, visiting over 130 countries during his career, giving rise to the famous joke back on campus, "What's the difference between God and Hesburgh?" God is everywhere. Hesburgh is everywhere but Notre Dame. When President Lyndon Johnson awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964, in recognition primarily for his work on the Civil Rights Commission, the 47-year-old priest was the youngest recipient in a group that included, among others, Helen Taussig, Aaron Copland, Edward R. Murrow, John Steinbeck, Walt Disney, and Helen Keller. And I don't mind dropping names because Hesburgh was a notorious name dropper. And I've heard stories of a luncheon on campus with Father Ted that was interrupted by a call from Henry Kissinger, or my doctoral advisor coming back after having dinner with Hesburgh the night before, in which the former university president couldn't remember if he had met Albert Einstein once or twice. So as fun as it would be to share stories about Hesburgh all night, like the fact that he was on the short list of civilians to go up in the space shuttle until the Challenger disaster made that impossible, dashing his hopes to be the first priest to say mass in space, or that he was a close personal friend of Eppie Lederer, also known as Ann Landers, and that he used to answer some of her letters in the paper. Really was a remarkable life. Or that he's in the Guinness Book of World Records for the most honorary degrees ever received, 150. I would love to tell those stories. I can't tell all those stories. So you just are going to have to buy my book. I guess that's the lesson tonight. $16.95, available on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Ships in time for Christmas. As fun as it would be to share these stories, I was asked to address a more focused topic, to reflect on what the life and work of Father Hesburgh has to say about the situation of the contemporary Catholic University during these troubling times. And these are troubling times. I don't need to tell you that. Troubling times for just about everyone and just about every institution, including Catholic universities. And really, some of the biggest challenges facing Catholic universities are those facing education, higher education in general. First on the list, of course, is the pandemic and the host of unprecedented problems it has presented for colleges and universities, right? How do you ensure the safety of students, faculty, staff, and the surrounding community? How do you reconfigure the physical plant to accommodate social distancing, new testing facilities, possible quarantine space, dining service, classroom technology? How do you revise policies and procedures on everything from class attendance to off-campus parties? How do you provide remote education for an entire student body? How do you prepare faculty to teach not only in person, not only online, but both together at the same time? And how do you balance the budget when in some places you're hemorrhaging millions of dollars a week in lost room and board revenue? It is daunting. And when I think about university administrators these days, I'm reminded of Father Hesburgh at the height of the 1960s student revolution, which was its own turbulent time, when students would roll out of bed to protest, often grinding campus life to a halt, when radicals were setting ROTC buildings on fire, overrunning and occupying administrative offices. One of Hesburgh's friends was Grayston Kirk, the president of Columbia University, and during this time, students really seized his office, barricaded themselves inside the president's office for days, ransacking his files, smoking his cigars, defecating on his rug. Hesburgh at the time used to carry a piece of paper, a yellow lined sheet of paper in his coat pocket on which he had a handwritten list of all the college presidents who had been forced out of office because of the turmoil. Even in tranquil South Bend, right? Student unrest was such that Hesburgh felt at any moment the whole thing could go out, could go up in smoke. It's around that time when a reporter asked him if he ever regretted taking on the job of president. Hesburgh replied, only about 10 times a week. And his standard joke at the time told the story of a university president who died and went to hell. It was 4 days before he noticed the difference. So this is not the first time that American higher education has faced unprecedented challenges. But I guess, as is always the case with unprecedented challenges, this time feels different. The acute budgetary pressures brought on by the pandemic simply accelerate and exacerbate the financial strain already being felt by all but the most elite colleges and universities. And I count Notre Dame among the elite colleges and universities. Thanks in part to Hesburgh and his successors, thanks largely, I should say, to Hesburgh and his successors, Notre Dame is clearly one of the elite. I mean, in its latest capital campaign, Notre Dame raised over $1 billion, with a B, billion, hardly breaking a sweat. Right? That's just not the reality for the rest of us. For tuition-driven colleges and universities, beyond the pandemic is this bigger story of a long and coming demographic downturn that is dramatically diminishing the pool of potential students. Years of draconian cuts in state support for higher education, rising costs related to everything from healthcare, insurance, technology needs, aging infrastructure and buildings, student support services and their demands, much of which has been financed by student debt, which has risen to levels that are clearly unsustainable. And all that debt contributes to an understandable concern among parents and potential students about the marketability of a college degree. After all, it's a pretty big investment to go to college these days. And if it's an investment, what's going to be the return? That's not an unfair question for parents and kids these days to ask. But this almost utilitarian approach then to education makes the university's traditional commitment to the liberal arts with their pursuit of truth, beauty, and the good seem like a quaint holdover from an earlier time, either irrelevant or just plain unintelligible to our students. Nice, I guess, but largely besides the point of a college degree. I mean, ask any high school senior or college student in your life the question, why are you going to college? I think you'll find the answer revealing. Meanwhile, the broader cultural context in this country encourages a kind of cynicism that eats away at the very foundation on which higher education is built. This kind of blatant disparaging of scientists, of other experts, of hard data, and even simple facts makes the university's mission to expand the treasury of human knowledge seem like a partisan endeavor. So troubling times indeed. And universities have their work cut out for them. And I do not have the answers to all of these challenges facing universities. I don't even think Father Hesburgh has the answers, not the answers that universities today have to craft. But I do think that his story offers an opportunity to step back and take in the bigger picture. What is this project that we call the university all about? What is this project that we call the Catholic University all about? If you've been paying attention so far, you will have noticed that all of the pressing problems I've listed apply to all institutions of higher learning, not just those that are Catholic. Catholic colleges and universities have their own distinctive challenges, but I want to argue tonight, they also have their own decided advantage. And that, I think, is the most important thing Father Hesburgh can teach us today. In many ways, Catholic universities were made for this moment. And it's not because of the strength of their balance sheets or some special donor base. It's not a secret mix of programs and majors or the perfect strategic plan. It is their fundamental commitment to a pursuit of the truth, beauty, and goodness that transcends the material world. It is the confidence that there is something more than what we can measure. That all of this, everything, ultimately makes sense. That life itself is a gift with meaning that we do not make, but only discover. And that precisely because the world is not all that there is, we are called to make this world a better place. That whatever work we find in it not only a way to make a living, not only a way to employ our talents, but also a way to serve others. That's the advantage of a Catholic university. Now, Catholics, of course, ground these commitments in, if I might use an old-fashioned word, God. A God who becomes incarnate in Jesus Christ. But the turn towards the transcendent marks every human person, however we articulate it or come to understand it. And so people of all faiths and of no faith find their place at a Catholic university in this shared pursuit of truth, beauty, and goodness. And their presence by no means detracts from, but in fact enriches and expands this distinctly Catholic mission. One thing I think that Hesburgh understood well is that vision is everything. Early in his presidency, Hesburgh laid out his vision for Notre Dame. I'll quote his autobiography. I envision Notre Dame as a great Catholic university, the greatest in the world. Self-confidence was not a trait that Hesburgh lacked. He wanted Notre Dame to be a great university, but also to be a great Catholic university. The first he thought was much easier to do than the second. For in his view, there were a lot of great universities, but Hesburgh believed not since the Middle Ages had there been a great Catholic university. So he saw himself as navigating uncharted waters. What is it then that makes a great university a great Catholic university? Well, early on, Hesburgh located the university's distinctively Catholic nature in the synthesizing and integrating role that theology played within the curriculum. And here I have to be careful. Hesburgh's doctorate was in theology. My doctorate was in theology. So this can all sound pretty self-serving. So it's important to note that at the time, Hesburgh wasn't alone in this belief, not only about theology, but about the importance of integration. In fact, for much of the first half of the 20th century, all universities, Catholic, non-Catholic, private, public, all universities were obsessed with integration. Curricular integration was the buzzword of the first half of the 20th century. And it was a concern that followed on the widespread reconfiguration of American higher education that stretched from the Civil War to the First World War. By the start of the 20th century, for example, both the effects of the Morrill Act, which established land-grant universities, and the influence of the German research model, which really transformed American colleges into universities, The effects of these shifts were already being felt, and you saw it in an expanding student body, in a clear demarcation between secondary and collegiate education, in the rise of the elective system, in standardized professional education and graduate programs, a preference for original research and scientific inquiry over mastering of the classics. And the rapid modernization that followed World War I brought with it even greater standardization in the form of accreditation, even greater specialization, a faculty divided by departments, even greater quantification, the whole credit hour system, even greater commodification as you reduce the requirements, expanded electives. And these departures from the traditional liberal arts program create a sense of fragmentation and a growing concern for curricular integration among Catholics and non-Catholics alike. And here Catholics felt, they really pressed what they felt was their advantage over their non-Catholic peers. And it was because we had Thomas Aquinas. The revival of Thomism, the thought of the medieval theologian philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas, the revival of Thomism in the late 19th century provided Catholic schools and Catholic scholars with a comprehensive alternative to the competing arguments of modern philosophers. It was a worldview in which everything from acorns to angels, flowed out of God to their pinnacle in the human person and returned to God. A brilliant, integral whole. And by the middle of the 20th century, Thomism was firmly ensconced in the philosophy and theology core requirements at Catholic colleges and universities. And so when Hesburgh became president in 1952, he accepted a common Catholic narrative, right? Looking back beyond World War I, he argued that powerful currents unleashed by the Reformation and the Enlightenment made, quote him, quote, the ordered flow of knowledge, these currents unleashed by the Reformation and the Enlightenment made the ordered flow of knowledge a swirling, churning vortex of conflicting assertions and denials. Amidst this disarray, Hesburgh argued, as did many Catholics at the time, only the Catholic University, grounded as it was in Thomistic theology and philosophy, could bring order to the human quest for understanding. Hesburgh borrowed, at this time in his career, liberally from John Henry Newman's classic 19th century text, The Idea of a University. Newman had argued that theology was necessary in a university because a university, by its very nature, professes to teach all knowledge. Were it not to teach the knowledge of God, theology, it would not be teaching all knowledge. And thus it would not be a university in the full and true sense. Moreover, because all knowledge, human and divine, is ultimately one, theology is essential for completing, integrating, and correcting all the other disciplines. So to be a great Catholic university, you had to have all the markers of a great university, great faculty, great students, great facilities, a great deal of money, but you also had to have great theology. And if you want just a window into this era, just a few months after his inauguration, Hesburgh launched a massive self-study of the liberal arts curriculum at Notre Dame. The final report, written by the philosophy professor Vincent Smith, began with the bald claim that theology, along with philosophy and its subsidiary role, was the linchpin to curricular integration at the university. The 300-page report that followed never questioned that basic premise. Indeed, one of the methods the review team used to gather data for their report was a series of interdepartmental colloquia in which faculty from all the other departments were expected to discuss how theology and philosophy related to their work. Boy, those were the days. But that was 1952. And within a few years, the conversation across higher education shifted from concern about integration to concern about excellence. This was in the midst of a kind of a national panic about falling behind. This is post-Sputnik, American panic about falling behind in the space race and by implication in the study of the science and mathematics and education in general. So it really became not so much integration, but excellence that was emphasized. And that became Hesburgh's clarion call. And by almost any measure of excellence, Hesburgh's first decade as president was a success. In a 1962 issue of Time magazine, which incidentally featured Hesburgh on the cover, the former chancellor of the University of Chicago, Robert Hutchins, called the Notre Dame, quote, the Notre Dame effervescence one of the most spectacular developments in higher education in the last 25 years. And although the same article pointed out that Notre Dame still had a long way to go to be counted among the nation's top schools, Hesburgh argued that Catholic universities like Notre Dame were trying to do something more. Yeah, the article ended with a long quote of Hesburgh in which he explained his kind of new view of the role of a Catholic university. We are committed to truth. Living in a world where most academic endeavor concerns only natural truth, as much separated from supernatural truth, the divine wisdom of theology, as sinful man was separated from God before the incarnation. If these extremes are to be united, a work of mediation is needed. We must somehow match secular or state universities in their comprehension of a vast spectrum of national truths in the arts and sciences, while at the same time we must be in full possession of our own true heritage of theological wisdom. So not only in this article, but throughout his speeches and writings at this time, you see this clear shift in Hesburgh's thinking, a shift away from a kind of early triumphalistic notion of the Catholic university set apart and superior to all others, like having something that the world does not, to what I would call a more humble sense of the Catholic university as not having something that the world does not, but as doing something that the world needs. And what is it that the Catholic university does? What it does is the work of mediation, of bridge building, of bringing together that which is divided. Now, the call to be a mediator, incidentally, was central to Hesburgh's own sense of vocation. He had read Thomas Aquinas, of course, and he knew that Aquinas defined the priest as a mediator, as a bridge, a link between God and humanity. And the ultimate mediator, of course, is Jesus Christ, the great high priest, who in his very person united humanity and divinity, and who through his death and resurrection reconciled the world to God. And so the ordained priest then participates in the priesthood of Christ, and thus the central purpose of his ministry, Hesburgh understood himself. The central purpose of his ministry is to continue Jesus's work of bridge building. But it's not just the ordained priest, the laity too, Hesburgh argued, and in this he was quite ahead of his time. The laity too participate in Christ's priesthood. They too are called into the breach to overcome divisions and bring people together. And so the Catholic University carries forward this work of mediation in the intellectual realm to bring together what is too often kept apart. If there was one phrase that drove Hesburgh crazy, it was George Bernard Shaw's quip that a Catholic university is a contradiction in terms. He could see sort of the point that religious dogma at times does seem incompatible with a scientific spirit of skeptical, free inquiry. But with his deep-seated Catholic confidence in the unity of faith and reason, Hesburgh would argue that such a claim follows on a fundamental misunderstanding of theology and of science. Or as he put it elsewhere in this article, there's no conflict between science and theology, except where there's bad science or bad theology. And I think the artist on the cover image there of Hesburgh holding a volume captures this theme that ran throughout Hesburgh's later years. because he's holding a book there with an icon of the Madonna and Child on one page, and facing it are what look like mathematical equations. But these can go together in a Catholic university. It is the special vocation of the Catholic University, Hesburgh would go on to argue, the special vocation to bring together good science and good theology, empirical exploration and the spiritual search, practical pursuits and ultimate questions, how to make a living and how to live. And theology would still play an essential role in Hesburgh's vision of the Catholic University, but not as some kind of synthesizing force colonizing all aspects of the university curriculum. Instead, theology's essential role was always to be in dialogue with other realms of knowledge. In this way, theology plays one part in helping the Catholic University fulfill its proper mission, namely to be a mediator, right? Helping to facilitate a sorely needed exchange between Christian wisdom and the world's most pressing problems. And this vision of the university as a mediator was most famously articulated in the Land O'Lakes Statement, which was a kind of a groundbreaking document. It really was just a working paper of this group named after Notre Dame's ecological retreat in northern Wisconsin at Land O'Lakes, in which in 1967, Hesburgh gathered a group of 26 leaders of Catholic universities in the United States and issued this document. It was meant to be a kind of a working group paper for an international conference. But it really kind of took on a life of its own because it began with a very clear affirmation of the centrality of academic freedom and institutional autonomy for the Catholic University to exist as a university. But at the same time, it spent a good amount of time talking about the important role of the Catholic University drawing together the insights of theology, ultimate questions, and the contemporary science and knowledge, literature, and everything else that the university studies. And that really becomes that vision of what we might call Hesburgh's mature vision of the Catholic University. It's that vision, I think, that remains so relevant today, right? The Catholic University is not a fortress to defend. It's not a monastery to endow or a business to manage. It's a mediator, called to engage both faith and reason, both church and society, both the sublime and the mundane, to bring together what is separated into a mutually enriching dialogue that opens up for students the meaning of their lives and helps them discover their own unique way to serve the common good. And I would just like to end with an image. It's certainly the most prominent artifact of Hesburgh's presidency, the Memorial Library on the campus of the University of Notre Dame, formerly renamed the Hesburgh Memorial Library after he retired, with its famous mural of Christ, the Word of Life. Now, a new library was the centerpiece of Hesburgh's first major fundraising initiative. A new library was meant to symbolize and to facilitate Notre Dame's newfound commitment to academic excellence. It's interesting. Early designs for the library placed it closer to the center of campus, near Sacred Heart Basilica. But some of those designs were really freaky and futuristic, with a kind of, you can see a kind of a cube-shaped glass complex replacing the historic administration building, which was in need of such repair that planners thought it might be better just to tear it down, but to save the Golden Dome by keeping the statue of Mary suspended in space on top of a narrow obelisk. Given the uproar from alumni that such a move would ignite, planners instead settled on a simpler modernist structure, a plain tower positioned on the edge of campus. east of the field house and just north of the stadium. To break the monotony, there's Hesburgh and his longtime right-hand man, Ned Joyce, going over plans. To break the monotony of the neutral stone that ran up this, this kind of grain elevator of a library, Notre Dame commissioned an enormous mural of Christ, the Word of Life, by the artist Millard Sheets. The original hope was for the mural to face west towards the heart of campus, towards the Basilica and the administration building. Flanked on the north, you can see the library plan there on the right edge of the screen. Be flanked on the north by a kind of modernist chapel, like right at Disneyland or something, and these kind of sky-rise dormitories. And on the south would be a new radiation lab and a computer building, which did end up getting built. This was going to be the new modern Notre Dame. However, when it became clear that the old field house would block the view of the mural, the architects rotated the building to the south so that Christ, with arms extended overhead in blessing, now looked down on the football stadium. So the library was dedicated in May of 1964, but before the first snap of the first game that fall, the Notre Dame Memorial Library had already been christened by students and fans as Touchdown Jesus. Hesburgh claims that in all the planning for the library, the idea of Touchdown Jesus never crossed his mind, which is a bit hard to believe. And although he came to like the nickname as kind of friendly and familiar, there's a way in which it can obscure what he wanted the library mural to communicate. The inspiration for the Word of Life mural came to Hesburgh on a 1955 tour of the recently completed library at the National Autonomous University in Mexico City. The library was designed by the noted Mexican artist Juan Orman as a 10-story windowless block covered in murals. Murals meant to showcase the Mexican government's achievements in modernizing the country. So the murals tell the story of Mexican history from a decidedly anti-colonial and by implication anti-Catholic perspective, privileging Mexico's pre-Christian past and its post-revolution present. And the most famous mural narrates Mexico's colonial era, where the notions of good and evil are presented as two circles that from a distance become the eyes of the Aztec god Tlaloc. Okay. One circle depicts Ptolemy, placing the earth at the center of the universe. The other portrays Copernicus with the sun at the center. Now, the idea is this, is that this is representing the view of the Spanish conquistadors, that the conquistadors would have seen these two as diametrically opposed. Ptolemy represents faith, what is good, according to the conquistadors. Copernicus represents science, which the conquistadors would have seen as bad. The idea conveyed by the mural that faith and science were antithetical offended Hesburgh. It seemed to say that Catholicism and academic inquiry were opposed to one another, that a Catholic university was in fact a contradiction in terms, which was precisely the opposite of what Hesburgh was trying to say at Notre Dame. And he made clear to donors and designers that he wanted the Word of Life mural to serve as a counterpoint to the Mexican City mural. By affixing a 132-foot image of Christ to the proudly modernist exterior of the library, Hesburgh proclaimed that bringing the ancient faith and modern reason together was the central mission of a great Catholic university. Instead of the mask of a pagan god, the unifying feature of Sheets' composition would be the cross, out of which rises Christ with arms outstretched. Surrounding Christ are 51 unnamed individuals representing the procession of human knowledge over the course of history. Light radiates from Christ, illuminating, as the literature describes it, quote, a never-ending line of great scholars, thinkers, and teachers, leading up to the great teacher, the Word of Life, Jesus. It's hard to imagine a better depiction of Hesburgh's worldview, a vision of excellence rooted in faith and engaged in the world. It's a vision more than an action plan, an ideal more than a set of solutions, a vision for the Catholic University in these troubling times. So that's the image that I would leave you with. Touchdown Jesus, the Word of Life mural. And I would look forward to talking a little bit about these ideas, your questions, and your own observations. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was really helpful in understanding the role of Ted Hesburgh in Catholic higher education in the 20th century. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I just want to remind people again, please use the chat function and ask the question directly to Ed, and he will respond to those. And we have probably 20 minutes or so to do that, depending on how lively things get. So please.
Okay, so this is a little bit awkward. I would much rather be in a room with you all and having some genuine dialogue. But if you have something you want to add to the conversation, the way to do it is at the bottom of your screen. I mean, right now you're either looking at a big old picture of me or a gigantic Brady Bunch screen. You move your cursor over the screen down to the bottom, you'll see a green arrow, share. No, that's not what you're going to see. You're going to see a little word bubble that says chat. If you click on that chat, at the bottom of the box that pops up is my name. And underneath that, you can type your question. And when you type that question, your question will come to me. I'll be able to see it, and then I'll see if I can respond. Okay. Great, I start to see them. Okay. So the first question, comment is, what happened to separation of church and state? Well, I think maybe I can just approach this in one way. First of all, by saying that talking about the Catholic University in a way is talking about a private institution founded by Catholics, typically religious orders of sisters or priests and brothers or friars. However, it's not enough to kind of say it's a private institution and thus is free to exercise its religious identity because of the way in which Catholic colleges and universities depend on, for example, federal funds. This was actually one of the reasons that colleges and universities began to transfer. It was certainly in the mind of Hesburgh in transferring the University of Notre Dame, its governance structure, to a board of lay trustees. There was a famous case in the early to mid 60s, the Horace Mann case, which denied a couple of colleges federal funds, grant funds, on the grounds that they were sectarian and thus couldn't be supported by the church and separation of church and state. By establishing lay boards of trustees, the Catholic colleges and universities allowed Catholic colleges and universities to function more as full universities in the US system and draw on those grants, for example, loans for students, so on and so forth. So the Hesburgh would have been a huge proponent of the disestablishment clause and the free exercise clause of the Constitution. But he would not have imagined church and state as separate in the sense of being hermetically sealed off against one another. For Hesburgh, one's religious commitments deeply influenced the way in which they engaged in the political life. And he felt very strongly that Catholics had an obligation that flowed out of their faith in order to engage the broader secular world. And again, I wish there were more back and forth so that we would continue this, but I'm seeing more questions pop up. So I'm going to address this. Keep going. My brother, okay, this is related. My brothers and one of my sons went to Notre Dame University. They felt that once Father Hesburgh started taking money from the government, they lost their religious independence. Do you agree? I guess the short answer there is no. In many ways, I think about this question whether or not to take government grants is a part of Hesburgh's larger commitment to see the Catholic University make a genuine contribution to the country. And that genuine controversy was going to be a truly great university would need to be engaged at the highest level of scientific research, the highest level of civic engagement, the highest level of sociological analysis, the highest level of educational theory, the highest level. And those kinds of projects, the research labs, the expense that goes with these kinds of grants, the Catholic universities needed access to those, or they were going to be what I think he feared the Catholic universities would be, parochial, that they would not be able to make a genuine contribution. So in all of this, Hesburgh really rejected a kind of, sectarianism that would cordon off the Catholic Church, for one, and the Catholic University as one important element of that larger church, that would cordon off the Catholic University from the broader society. That he was all about engagement because he felt that the Catholic tradition had something really important to contribute. Okay, the next question, could you talk a bit more about the influence of sports, especially football, on the success of Notre Dame? Yeah, for sure. So Hesburgh, Hesburgh spent 3 years as the executive vice president. It was a new office created by his predecessor, John Kavanaugh. It was sort of like his on-the-job training on steroids. And he did that for 3 years and then was president. One of the first assignments that Kavanaugh gave Hesburgh was the task of reorganizing the athletic department. And this was at the height of Frank Leahy's dynasty, the winningest football coach in the country, a legend in his own right. I think at that point he had won 3 national titles. He had an unbroken winning streak. But Kavanaugh didn't like the fact that Leahy, because he was so enormously influential, basically operated independently of the university administration. And he asked Hesburgh to bring him into line. So here's a 35-year-old priest who hadn't played football since elementary school, being asked to take on the kind of most famous football coach in the country. And it had very concrete issues at stake, like, for example, who does the coach report to, whether or not the coach is going to listen to the team doctors on whether or not players can play, what's the size of the traveling team, I mean, all these kinds of things. And so Hesburgh said to Kavanaugh at the time, at least his recollection was, you may have to choose between a executive vice president and a football coach, because this is not going to go over well. And Kavanaugh kept pressing him, and he said, well, you might very well lose a football coach, when Kavanaugh assured Hesburgh that he has full support. And Kavanaugh said, well, we can live with that. So there was a really remarkable reorganization. Hesburgh created the position of athletic director, convincing Moose Krause, who was the kind of famous basketball coach at the time, to take over. It really kind of came to a head that fall when Leahy sent a long list of guys for the travel team, and Hesburgh wrote back saying, no, you only get whatever it was, 38, whatever the Big Ten regulations were. And Leahy backed down. So that's just a little insight. When Hesburgh was first named president, it was a press conference on the West Coast where he's being introduced. He got so angry because only sports writers appeared at the press conference. And one of them asked him if he would pose with a football in the hiking position, which he refused to do. And he privately vowed to ban the image of Notre Dame as a football factory. Right? So he had very strong feelings, but he was also a shrewd man. He knew that Knute Rockne, the football team, put Notre Dame on the map. He knew that there was that the football team provided the kind of visibility to generate the kind of base to make the changes that he wanted to make. So it's been a constant, I would say, tension throughout Notre Dame's story about, how do you maintain your commitment to excellent academics at the same time committing to excellence in athletics. And that's the way in which he framed it. When he fired Terry Brennan, a very controversial move after Frank Leahy's successor, he was accused of sort of caving to alumni wanting wins. And his response very defiantly was, look, I'm about excellence. And as long as we're going to be competing in interscholastic athletics, we're going to be excellent on the field as well as off the field. Now, we can raise all kinds of questions, I think, about the role that college athletics play in colleges and universities. And Notre Dame is a huge part of that story, but it's not the only place where that's a real issue that I think deserves more sustained attention and expertise than I can give it. Next question, comment. What was Hesburgh's view of the proper relation of the Catholic University to the church hierarchy? It's a great question because it specifies, I mean, at least it implies, right, Hesburgh's conviction that the church is broader than just the hierarchy, the leadership structure. That the church obviously includes the hierarchy. There's a very important role of leadership within the community, but he also saw the university, Catholic University, as having a role to play within that larger church. It was interesting. He had some experiences early on that I think really shaped his attitude towards the hierarchy. And they included when he was first president, I want to say around 1954, Notre Dame put together a conference on church and state that involved a presentation and later a paper by John Courtney Murray. Now, for those of you who don't know, John Courtney Murray was a Jesuit theologian and priest, probably the most famous American Catholic theologian of the 20th century. And his big contribution had to do with the religious freedom and the nature of the act of faith in a pluralistic society. But he was, because of sort of theological Catholic positions, I don't want to kind of get bogged down into, basically, he was on the blacklist at the Vatican in the years before Vatican II. Because at the time, the Vatican still looked somewhat waringly put it mildly, on the American experiment in democracy. So John Courtney Murray gave this talk, and Notre Dame Press was bringing out a volume that included his essay. And the head of the Holy Office at the time, what's now the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, Cardinal Octaviani, who would go on to become sort of a leader of the conservative party at Vatican II, he put pressure on Hesburgh superiors to pull the book from publication because it included this essay by John Courtney Murray. And for Hesburgh, that was a key moment for him to realize that if Notre Dame was going to be a university, it had to have the kind of academic freedom that would allow for, on issues that were open theological issues, that he could not, as he saw it, bow to the pressures of a Vatican official, that he had to make a strong case, and he made a strong case for publishing the volume and really maintaining the academic integrity of the university. There were other examples and other stories I could share, but in fact, one of the things that I think got all the press in 1967 surrounding the Land O'Lakes statement was its opening lines, which said essentially, for a Catholic university must be first and foremost a university in the full modern sense of the word. And in order to do that, it must possess the academic freedom and institutional autonomy free from influence of other outside forces. So he was very firm on wanting to maintain independence for the Catholic University from the magisterium. At the same time, he wanted to affirm the profound contribution and place for the Catholic University within the broader church.
Ed?
Yes.
This is Paul Murphy, and I just want to suggest that perhaps we have time for one more question.
Okay.
And then we can go on from there, but thank you so much so far.
Great, and I'm so sorry, I'm seeing all the questions that I'm not going to get to. If I might, I think I'll jump to, I see Paul asking a question, and I'll give you the moderator's privilege here, the last question. How did Hesburgh understand the role of the Catholic University in terms of the renewal of the church in the years during and after the Second Vatican Council? Hesburgh was, of course, deeply rooted in his own upbringing in the pre-conciliar church, but he was always looking forward. And he saw the Second Vatican Council as a breath of fresh air in bringing the church. The most important thing for Hesburgh was bringing the Roman Catholic Church at a national level into constructive, positive dialogue with the modern world. So he saw that as having a profound implication on all aspects of the university. In fact, I share one personal story here. I did not work closely with Father Hesburgh. I was an undergraduate student. I began at Notre Dame in 1991. So he had been retired for a few years. But he was around, and I met him early on in my freshman year. And then I ran into him later on when I was on my third degree, working on my Ph.D., because at the time I had a small study carrel on the 12th floor of the Hesburgh Memorial Library. And by that point, Hesburgh had been retired for years, but he still came into the office every day. And after he retired, he moved from the Golden Dome to the top of the library that he built. He had a wonderful kind of office suite with chapel and everything on the 13th floor of the library. And so I often ended up on the elevator with Father Ted. And he loved to talk to students. He'd always engage students and share stories with students. And I had the same conversation with him 3 times. That's the kind of impression I made on him. right? And remember that we had had these conversations before. He asked me, what are you studying, Ed? Or what are you working on today? And I said, oh, I'm working on my PhD in theology. And he looked at me and said, I got my PhD in theology. What's your topic? And so I'm writing on lay ministry in the Catholic Church. He looked at me and said, I wrote my dissertation on the laity in the church. And he said, you know, it was a very controversial topic at the time. This was the 1940s, remember? And my advisor at the time warned me not to write on the topic. He didn't think it would get approved. This was the period before the council. But I pushed ahead and went ahead and, despite his warnings, wrote my dissertation on the theology of the laity. And as soon as it came out, I got it published. And then I got a letter, official request from the Holy Office in Rome, asking for 2 copies of my dissertation. He said, now remember, it used to be called the Holy Office of the Inquisition. So I thought for sure I was going to be censured, but dutifully sent my copies in, and I never heard back. Pius XII died. They elected this roly-poly, smiling Italian, Pope John the 23rd, and who shortly after his election calls the Second Vatican Council. And what do you know is on the agenda? The laity. I'll never forget, he said to me seriously, I'll never forget reading that document on the laity from Vatican II when it first came out. They stole all my ideas. So when he was asked later in life, why did he transfer ownership of the university to a lay board of trustees? He said, look, Vatican II called on the laity in the church to take up responsibilities commensurate with their experience, expertise, and gifts. And we took that seriously. So he later in life drew a direct line from his early work on the laity to his faith in his lay collaborators in helping to lead the university to the success of Notre Dame in the years that followed. So anyway, he was very pro-Vatican II. And I apologize, I can't get to all these questions. They're good. I would love to continue to share stories, but enough is enough. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed, very much. And I know all of you for whom this may be your first encounter with Ed Hahnenberg, you now recognize how fortunate we are at John Carroll University to have him on our faculty and everything that he brings to his interactions with other faculty and with our students especially. So insofar as we can in this strange world of Zoom, please give him a nice round of applause. You know? Thank you very much. And I want to thank again the Office of Alumni Relations, the Notre Dame Club, the Institute of Catholic Studies. And I also want to assure you we'll be sending out more announcements about events, especially in the second semester. I do want to point out that next year will be the 500th anniversary of the conversion of St. Ignatius of Loyola, of that day in 1521 when he got hit in the leg with a cannonball. As a result of that, John Carroll University is in existence. Ed taught Ignatius theology when he was a young man, but we will be having a number of events on campus to recognize this and what the significance of that turning point is for the Catholic Church and for the Society of Jesus. I look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to one of my colleagues for bringing her cat. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without a cat. Thank you very much and have a good night. Bye-bye.